2024 was a great year for exercise science. Few people realize it, but we get more cool hypertrophy studies in 1 year now than we got in several years in the early 2000s. These 5 studies in particular have changed the way I train going into 2025. Fortunately, I was able to interview the people behind the research, so you can make your workouts more effective. In October, a group of researchers in Florida pre-printed a meta-analysis on one of the most important topics in bodybuilding: volume, frequency, and muscle growth. See, there's been a lot of controversy online over these past few years. Low volume training has seen a resurgence, with Mike Menster clips getting millions of views online. Likewise, fitness influencers like Menno Henselmans have long been claiming that high frequency training builds more muscle than low frequency training. In their meta-analysis, Josh and his colleagues looked at all the research on the topic. But one important question arose: how do you count sets? Let's take the push down as an example. Of course, it's a tricep isolation exercise, so you should count it as a full set towards the tricep training. But what about the bench press or the overhead press? Those involve your chest and your shoulders, so those could give out before the triceps do. How should you count them? A full set? Half a set? 0 sets? That was one of the questions Josh and his colleagues answered.
And one of the main findings of our analysis is that fractional sets had the best predictive power for the amount of hypertrophy that you achieved in these studies. So kind of one of our first takeaways here is that when you're quantifying your own volume, you can count it however you want, but probably the most accurate way to do so based on the research is to count using some sort of fractional system for exercises that indirectly train the muscle that you're trying to grow.
Think of any movement. What is the main muscle group it is targeting? For that muscle, the movement counts as a full set. For any other muscles that are involved, simply count this as a half a set. With that in mind, how many sets should we aim for to maximize muscle growth?
As you did additional sets per week, you see additional hypertrophy. We did find that that relationship resembles diminishing returns. So in other words, as you go from 0 sets per week to 5 sets per week, you're going to see the greatest return on investment. As you go from 5 sets to 10 sets per week, you're still going to see robust hypertrophy, but the net benefit is going to be slightly less than that previous interval.
More is more. Get your 8-hour arm workouts ready. We're going to the moon. That's because while we usually think of volume as having an inverted U relationship with hypertrophy, this study, the most comprehensive meta-analysis on training volume yet, hasn't found that ceiling. More is more. Importantly, that seemed to apply whether they were looking at short versus long rest times, at trained lifters versus untrained lifters, and even when looking at every study that took all sets to failure. Now, I don't expect everyone to just start doing 30 sets for every muscle all at once. There's a potential recovery question there. Can we train every muscle with high volume at once? We just don't know that yet. These findings may be best applied to specialization phases, where you take certain muscles and train them with very high volumes, and take other muscles and reduce the volume for those. Just be aware that you're trading off high return sets for low return sets for the muscles you're specializing on. More saliently though, there's a more practical barrier to training with high volumes: time. Most people don't have the time to do that many sets. Fortunately, there are a few studies that came out this year that can help you make your workouts more time efficient too. We'll get into that in a bit. Personally, this volume research just makes me way more comfortable pushing volume for all muscle groups to around 20 to 30 weekly sets, and I've been just fine. I've been training to failure consistently, and I've been recovering just fine. I likely grow more muscle using this approach. But what about frequency? How often should you train each muscle for maximum hypertrophy?
Higher frequencies appear to have a neutral to slightly positive effect at a given training volume. So if you're doing 10 sets for a given muscle, if you were to do all of those sets in one session versus all of those sets spread across 2 sessions, so 5 sets per session, spreading it across 2 sessions might have a positive effect, but it's probably not a primary training variable or something you need to overly stress about.
Importantly, Josh and his colleagues are also working on a meta-analysis on per session volume, which suggests that the best training frequency may scale with how much volume you're doing. Basically, just like with weekly volume, per session volume has a diminishing returns relationship with hypertrophy. So when you're specializing on arms, you're likely better off spreading out that volume across the week, instead of just doing 1 or 2 8-hour arm workouts. As a result, I think you should aim to train each muscle twice a week. From there, you can tweak things further. For every 5 to 10 sets you do for a muscle in a given week, add an extra training day. If you're aiming to train your biceps with, say, 15 to 25 sets a week, for example, that would land you at 3 to 5 days for your biceps a week. That's why, when specializing, you're best off using a full body routine, and why the push-pull leg split is surprisingly impractical. I have a whole video on routines you can check out here. Fun fact, back when we first got these results from Josh Pelland, the first thing we ever did was integrate them into MyoAdapt. MyoAdapt is constantly being updated by the latest findings in exercise science, so you'll always get cutting-edge workouts to make your physique improve as fast as possible. MyoAdapt is the coach in your pocket. It's smarter than anything on the market right now, and already better than many coaches. It's launching very soon. Go to myoadapt.com now, register your email, and you'll receive a free trial when it launches, as well as a lifetime discount if you sign up. In 2024, we were graced with one of the first studies looking at training past failure. Full disclosure, I was one of the authors on this study, but the main man was Stian Larsen up in Norway.
So this study compared two calf race conditions to see how they affect medial gastrocnemius growth. So over 10 weeks, we had 23 untrained men that performed split machine calf races unilaterally twice a week. So they trained one leg to failure using full range of motion, and they stopped when they could no longer lift fully, a full repetition. Whereas the other leg also trained to failure, but added extra partial repetitions in the more lengthened position after reaching full range of motion failure. So participants performed 4 sets of 10 to 20 repetitions and had a double progression method with also around 30 seconds rest between legs and 2 minutes between sets. And we measured the muscle thickness of the medial gastrocnemius with ultrasound, both pre and post intervention.
So that was the design of the study. What about the results? Did training past failure actually increase muscle growth?
What happened was that the lean that trained with past failure partial and incorporated this into the set after reaching full range of motion failure grew their gastrocnemius around 9.6% compared to around 6.7% for the condition that terminated the set at just momentary failure in the plantar flex position. Also, what interesting here was that the participants were capable of doing around 8 to 9 repetitions with past failure partial after reaching full range of motion failure, which I speculate could partially explain the findings though.
There are two ways of looking at these results. On the one hand, you could say that the additional hypertrophy was caused by focusing on the stretch. Those reps past failure took place there after all. On the other hand, there might have been something about training past failure. In 2023, the most comprehensive meta-analysis on training to failure for muscle growth did find more muscle growth as we approach failure, which makes you think that the same could hold true as you train past failure too. My suspicion? It's both. But see, that's actually great news for many of us. Most of you hate doing just lengthened partials. So if you can get most of the benefit by doing lengthened supersets, where you do full range of motion first and then partials, and you can get most of the benefit of lengthened partials, that's a sweet deal. Plus, this is one of the approaches that might make sense when you're short on time and trying to squeeze more muscle growth out of your gym time. Doing that lengthened superset doesn't take any additional time, but you get more growth from each set. Once you hit full range of motion failure, just keep the step going, doing partials until you can't even get another partial. Just don't take a lift where you can get pinned and then someone has to bail you out and you're embarrassed for the rest of your life. This next study might be the one that surprised me the most. Only a year and a half ago, I went on record saying that short rest times, much less than 2 to 3 minutes, were substantially worse for muscle growth. Well, it turns out I was probably wrong. I even made a video saying as much. Once again, I was a co-author in this study. One of my roles was to look at all the individual studies and extract the results for analysis. My colleague Brad Schoenfeld was also involved. We took all the studies that manipulated rest times and measured muscle growth. We found that shorter rest times were worse for growth, but only if they were under 60 seconds. Resting just 60 to 120 seconds between sets was sufficient to maximize growth. Going past this didn't increase muscle growth any further. After receiving the results of our meta-analysis, I've been resting just 60 to 90 seconds for upper body exercises or isolation exercises, and closer to 90 or 120 seconds for lower body exercises or compound exercises. In all likelihood, I'll grow just as much muscle that way, but I'll be saving time. A common rebuttal my viewers had in response to these findings was that there was no way that they would get the rest hypertrophy from only resting 1 to 2 minutes between sets, since they were so much more advanced than the subjects in these studies. Do you think our recommendations would be much different for advanced lifters versus less well-trained lifters?
So it's very speculative because we just don't have that. Again, I said there was limitations in the research. I do think from a logical standpoint, if you're using very heavy loads, that would be another caveat to this that might demand more recovery. But I think also you have to balance that with the fact that in general, advanced lifters tend to recover better. They build up a stamina. There is some evidence that when you consistently train with somewhat shorter reps, that your recovery enhances, that you get greater buffering capacity. I think that is a fair comment or a fair point to make, but I certainly don't think you can just take that for granted and say that's the case. We need evidence. We need research on that, and that just hasn't been done yet.
My viewers also made a similar critique when it comes to paired supersets. In a traditional superset, you take 2 exercises for the same muscle and perform them back to back. With a paired superset, you take 2 muscles that do not have the same functions and superset them. Instead of really hammering one muscle, the aim here is instead to get more training in less time. The idea is that since you're targeting different muscles with the 2 exercises, performance shouldn't be impaired, and you should be able to get the same muscle growth but in far less time. Earlier this year, 3 studies to date had already found this to be the case. Compared to just performing training the traditional way, doing these paired supersets allowed lifters to gain the same amount of muscle but in 30 to 50% less time spent training. However, the comments got to us. So we decided to run a study in trained lifters with an average of over 3 years of lifting experience.
A superset study aimed to look at, we did agonist-antagonist supersets, which is probably the most common form of superset. And for those who perhaps don't know, it's when you're looking at muscles on the opposing sides of the body that function in what are called an agonist-antagonist relationship, whereas one is working, the other is relaxing. So we looked at biceps, triceps, and quads and hamstrings, and we had subjects do either training with traditional sets where they just did 3 sets of each, leg extensions, leg curls, biceps curls, triceps press downs, or they did these exercises in superset fashion. One was immediately followed by the other.
The results? We observed similar bicep, triceps, quads, and hamstring hypertrophy when supersetting versus performing traditional training. There is a potential caveat here though.
I think if you're going to add on volume, that could become problematic over time with doing supersets, particularly if they do increase the perceived exertion that's involved, which conceivably would affect recovery. Certainly, I think with selectively using them, you can selectively say, all right, I'm going to do them for my biceps and triceps today, or maybe just I'll do squats and then leg press, and then I'll do a superset of leg curls.
Since this study came out, I've been supersetting exercises a lot more. After all, we now have 4 studies showing supersets can build just as much muscle while saving up to 30 to 50% time, even in trained lifters. There's even more data on performance that shows that supersetting usually doesn't harm performance. Pick 2 muscles that don't interfere with one another. The biceps and triceps, the quads and the hamstrings, chest and the back. Do a set of 1 exercise. Rest for about 30 to 45 seconds, or however long it takes to no longer be out of breath. Do a set of the other exercise. Repeat until all your sets are done. You commenters commonly complain about practical feasibility, especially in a busy gym. Pick exercises for each muscle that you can easily access. You can pick exercises with similar equipment requirements. Every major muscle usually has 1 good exercise that you can do with a given piece of equipment. Let's say you have dumbbells on the bench, or even just a barbell, or even just body weight. There's going to be something you can do for any 2 major muscles using just that 1 piece of equipment. I'd be remiss not to mention our own study. We tested lengthened partials against a full range of motion for muscle growth. Focusing on the stretch has been the most controversial topic in the fitness industry for a while now. The detractors will say that it does nothing for anyone except beginners. I have a whole video on that topic you can check out. At any rate, it is true that studies in trained lifters are few and far between, especially looking at lengthened partials specifically.
We've recruited the most highly trained participants we could. To take part, people needed to have at least 6 months of training experience, but many of the people we got in had far more than that, for an average of around 3 to 4 years of training experience.
Why don't all studies examine trained lifters? Progress is slow. You'd be lucky to gain 2 pounds in a year, let alone see much progress in 8 weeks, or be able to tell whether lengthened partials or full range of motion caused more growth in just 8 weeks.
To remedy this issue, we'll be using within participant design, wherein each trained lifter is assigning their left and right arm to do either full range of motion or lengthened partials. If their left arm was randomized to be full range of motion, for instance, their right arm would be lengthened partials. And we're counterbalancing this to wash out any effect of limb dominance on hypertrophy. Because we're comparing the effect of different training interventions on 2 sides of the same people, we can ensure the differences aren't due to, for example, sleep, stress, nutrition, or anything else that could otherwise impact hypertrophy. Specifically, we used ultrasound technology to look at the thickness of the elbow flexors, the biceps, the brachialis, the brachioradialis, and the elbow extensors, the triceps brachii, before the intervention and after the intervention, to see how much growth partial range of motion and full range of motion really caused.
We had lifters do different chest press variations, bicep curls, tricep extensions, and both pull downs and rows for 8 weeks. The only difference was that while one arm was trained exclusively with a full range of motion, the other arm was trained exclusively with lengthened partials. Importantly, for both arms, they still got a good stretch and paused in the stretch. Our results? Let's ask the lead author. So what happened? Which arm grew more muscle? Thank you for asking me, Dr. Wolf. First of all, we observed 49% of an increase in muscle size over 8 weeks in the arms. But I'm of two minds about these results. On the one hand, it's entirely possible that 8 weeks just wasn't long enough to really observe a benefit to lengthen partials over a full range of motion. The second possibility is that by using a variety of exercises, pausing in the stretch, controlling the eccentric, and even using some exercises that emphasize the stretch may have been enough stretch focus to maximize hypertrophy, even in a full range of motion condition. Beyond this one study, there's been more studies on the stretch that came out this year. They're still generally supportive of there being a benefit to a stretch, or at the very worst, you see similar muscle growth. I see focusing on the stretch as a winning strategy, and there's a fair bit of evidence to suggest you'll grow more muscle by doing so. I've been doing lengthened partials on basically all movements, with a few exceptions. I've still been picking stretch-focused exercises. If you want to see the best exercises for each muscle, check out my tier list series. If you'd like a full update on the stretch research, leave a comment below. I'm currently involved in about half a dozen more studies on the stretch that will be pre-printed, and I'd be more than happy to talk about them. Yes, these studies' results will only work in 2025. Will high volume get nerfed? Will the stretch be good for building muscle? But before you go, don't forget to cop Rascal apparel drip. If you don't, your friends will make fun of you all year for your whack fits. Rascal is durable, stylish, and squat-proof. Go to rascalapparel.com and use code WOLF at checkout for 10% off. Happy New Year. Go get them.